Let's get to the breaking news right now. President Trump has arrived at the NATO summit in Turkey. He's been highly critical of several members of the alliance over their defense spending, telling them to step up. President Trump is also carrying a grudge after his requests for help with the Iran war were largely ignored by key NATO members. Joining us now is Ivo Daalder, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and he's now a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, and retired U.S. Army General Wes Clark. He's the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. Ambassador Daalder, let me start with you. Will NATO leaders be able to placate President Trump at this summit in Turkey this week?
Well, they're certainly going to try because, after all, U.S. Commitment to European security is fundamental not only to European security, but to American security. And they will remind and will try to remind the president of two fundamental realities. Number one is that, in part because of his push, they are now spending significantly more on defense than they have for quite a while. And as in doing so, they will be spending more to buy capabilities, both European but also American. And this helps American jobs, but it also helps the defense of NATO by having equipment that is capable of working in concert with American forces. And secondly, I think they're going to remind him that that having a strong and capable NATO is the best way to preserve peace, to deter war. And after all, with peace and deterring war, we are all far more secure than we would otherwise be. It's going to be a hard sell because the president isn't convinced of either of those arguments, but I think they'll try as hard as they can.
General Clark, NATO, as you well know, is 77 years old. And for most of that history, the United States certainly has wanted to lead the group and has led the group. Now, apparently, under President Trump, it doesn't. Secretary General Mark Rutte said in an op-ed in the Washington Post, and I'm quoting him now, America's allies are making clear that their mindset has shifted. Renewed collective strength, not unhealthy dependencies, will drive peace, security, and prosperity for the years ahead, end quote. Is there now a clear path ahead for where NATO is headed? And you know this subject well.
I don't think there's a clear path ahead. I think the United States participation and even leadership with critical military capabilities that the Europeans don't have is absolutely fundamental to the deterrent mission that the ambassador spoke of. So it's the problem, Wolf, is that we've given the impression to the Europeans that we're not going to be there if there's a crisis. We've made it difficult for democratic leaders of these countries to go to their population and say, don't worry, the Americans will be there, because what they're seeing is the public statements of the president and the vice president and so forth. And so it's confusing to them, and they're leaders of democracy. So yes, they're going to try to do the best they can to put together something. But without the United States as the heart of this, it's not likely to work. It's our nuclear capability, our deterrence, our depth, our ability in air power, our intelligence in space, all of that, the reliance is absolutely fundamental to successful deterrence for NATO. And there's no replacement for it yet.
Ambassador Daalder, President Trump implied that the only reason even is attending the current NATO summit because that was a courtesy to Turkey's president, who is a close ally. And now Trump says he is considering selling F-35 fighter jets to Turkey. That's against the wishes of Congress, certainly against the wishes of Israel. Is there deep concern this could upset the balance of power in the region if it happens?
Well, the sale of F-35s was long ago concluded, and the only reason it was stopped is because Turkey bought S-400 air defense systems from the Russians, which posed a fundamental threat to NATO's integrated air defense system. If the president is now willing to sell F-35s when he wasn't in 2018 when he canceled the contract, then I hope we also have resolved the S-400 issue. But there's a larger question here, which is that the president's saying that he's going to this summit not because he believes fundamentally in the strength and importance of NATO, but because he wants to be a friend to a person who is locking up his opposition in terms of in Turkey. is a problem, of course. As General Clark emphasized, the United States is critical for the defense of Europe, but it's also critical, the defense of Europe is critical to the defense of the United States. And to go and say, I'm only coming because Erdogan is my friend, rather than to say, this is an important alliance that I want to contribute to, and I want to transform and continue to transform into one in which the Europeans are more able, more capable, working alongside us, is, I think, a lost opportunity.
You know, it's really significant, General Clark, and you know this subject well. Sources telling CNN that President Trump actually considered slashing U.S. troops in Europe in the NATO alliance by about 1/3. Right now, there are about 70,000 U.S. troops in the NATO alliance. 25,000 would be gone if, in fact, the president went ahead and slashed that number. What would that mean if the U.S. were to do that?
It would mean that, first, it would be a strong political signal to Vladimir Putin that the United States is not that strongly committed to NATO. So it undercuts deterrence. It would further increase the fears of our European allies. It would reduce their willingness to support us in other diplomatic and other efforts in the Middle East or elsewhere. It's just a move that really doesn't make sense from the U.S. overall strategic point of view. If you're interested in the security of the United States, those 25,000 or 30,000 extra troops, it's insignificant to the United States budget, but it's really significant diplomatically, strategically, militarily in Europe, and especially, Wolf, since the United States just warned Poland that Vladimir Putin is about to come in with some kind of a trick, some kind of game, some provocation against Poland. It's the exact wrong time to announce any redisposition of American forces.
And most of those U.S. troops in the NATO alliance who are based in Europe are either in Britain, Italy, or Germany. We'll see what happens on that front. Ambassador Ivo Daalder, General Wesley Clark, to both of you, thank you very much.